In reiterating my position that same-sex marriage should not be the top priority of the LGBT civil rights movement, I would like to open with a story. This story is not a happy one. It concerns University of Wyoming student Matthew Shepard. Matthew was 21 years old when he accepted a ride home one night from two peers of his in October of 1998. He never saw the next morning. On account of being homosexual, he was beaten, tortured, and left tied to a fence to die. While some hate crimes legislation was finally passed in 2009 as a result of this horrific tragedy, this legislation does not specifically address the queer community. It merely classifies crimes targeted at people based on sexual orientation, which includes heterosexuals, by the way, as hate crimes, rather than providing decisive protection for LGBT individuals. Transgender people, meanwhile, have been completely forgotten, as they are targeted for their gender preferences, not necessarily for those who they are attracted to. Significantly, more legal action is thus needed. This is just one example of an issue facing the LGBT community that is simply far more pressing than the legalization of same-sex marriage. I have cited this and other issues previously, namely employment discrimination and intolerance spurned by ignorance, as taking precedence over same-sex marriage in the LGBT civil rights movement. Despite my opponent's arguments to the contrary, this position remains sound. My opponent discussed how the current illegality of same-sex marriage in most states leads youth to feel that being attracted to a person of the same sex is a criminal act. This may be true. However, we must consider the fact that an equal amount of this characterization as criminal results from discrimination in the workplace. It is not legal for queers to work here can easily translate into it is not legal to be queer. Furthermore, doesn't the stigmatization that LGBT youth face on a daily basis emphasize this feeling of being criminal even more decisively? Are not LGBT youth going to feel more like a criminal and less like a human person because of the threats that face them in the present instead of the possible threats that may face them many years down the road? Too often, as my opponent stated, the stigmatization of LGBT youth leads to severe depression and even suicide. Too often, rampant homophobia leads to bullying that may turn so violent as to become deadly. The LGBT civil rights movement simply cannot ignore these problems, and it cannot choose to believe that legalizing same-sex marriage will make these problems go away. While the legalization of same-sex marriage would no doubt have an overall positive effect on the community at large, let us not forget the particular risks involved, especially for those LGBT individuals suffering from depression or abuse. First, those LGBT individuals for whom marriage is something much further down the road, who are merely worried about trying to make it through the next day content and unassaulted, may only feel more defeated when a movement supposedly fighting for them refuses to give enough attention to their potentially life-threatening problems. Second, as I have stated before, the legalization of same-sex marriage promises serious backlash, which could lead to an escalation of intolerance, bullying, and other forms of discrimination, thus achieving the exact opposite effect of what my opponent anticipates. Thus, the problems with making same-sex marriage the top priority of the LGBT civil rights movement remain very clear. Again, it is not effective because it still leaves much of the LGBT community vulnerable to potentially life-threatening issues. It is not holistic because it symbolically, if not logistically, alienates transgender people, and it does not truly work to address the problems of those not seeking same-sex marriage. And it is not prudent because the fight for same-sex marriage will be easier won a few years in the future, after more pressing issues have been already taken care of.